Okay, so I'm going to try and race through an introduction to the subject of early Roman building in timber. So we're talking about what we would call in more recent times carpentry, and I've always tried to find out what the Roman term for this type of woodworking is. I've asked Roman historians on many occasions, and to be honest, I've never got an answer. So in early medieval England, we might say tree writing. In later medieval England, we might say carpentry, borrowing the word from the French, and so on. But I'm really not sure what a Roman would call someone who built buildings, bridges, waterfront structures, and the like. Maybe someone can tell me at the end of this talk. That would be great. I think it might be lignari, as the Italian for carpenter, I've been told by colleagues, is falegnari, but I don't know. Okay, so if we're going to talk about the revolutionary changes in structural woodworking in the Roman period in Britain that they introduced, we have to know what was happening before. Now, one or two of you may recognize the building shown on stilts, on piles in this picture. It's the Crannog Centre at Loch Tay, which very sadly burnt down last Friday. So it's an archaeological interpretation centre, and it's an extremely sad thing to have seen. Now, what it's on here for is to show you what is a typical structure of the Iron Age, late Bronze Age, Iron Age period, which is the period of this dwelling and pile structure. And the key thing is that the key structural systems used for building houses in the pre-Roman period in Britain involve building mostly round structures. There are a few rectangular ones, but they're very much in the minority. A lot of the woodwork is woven together. So it's a kind of basketry, or what we would call wattle work, which you can see towards the top left of the slide here. I'm sorry, I can't move the arrows for you. And the timbers, the larger elements, are mainly used in the round. So square timbers essentially don't exist. Other timbers can be split into various sections, but structures made of square timbers are virtually unknown in the pre-Roman period in Britain, except to some limited extent for doorposts. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, hang on. The boat in the foreground is one we built as an outreach project for kids based on a local example. But that's not what we're here for today. So let's start with the raw materials they use. One of the things we're able to do in London with the help of a large team of botanists and tree ring specialists and experimenters in woodworking of different kinds and woodland management systems is to reconstruct what kinds of woodland, or we would say tree land to be really specific, were around in the early Roman period. So in London, that's roughly the AD 50s onwards, or the very late AD 40s onwards, until about 400 plus a bit AD. So here we're looking at tall, dark woodland on the western edge of London in the Chiltern Hills. There are beech trees here and oak trees. We know that semi-natural or more or less natural, what we would call wildwood, high dark woodland with very large oak trees was there in the early Roman period in places around London. A lot of it was used to build the waterfront structures that some of you may have read about, and subdivided into smaller pieces, the same trees were also used to build buildings. Next slide, please. Okay, we're just talking about the woodland types the Romans had available in the London area in the late AD 40s when they started to build the town up. So I mentioned wildwood, woodland, high, tall, big oak trees, and what you can see in the foreground is very small oak trees. And those of you who are familiar with the system will know that what you're looking at is repeatedly harvested oak tree stems. We call this coppicing in England. So this is intensively managed woodland. This is woodland on the southeast edge of London, and we know that this is another type of woodland that the Romans had access to. We have many building timbers made out of this small, fairly straight logs from trees grown from what we call stools, which you can see in the background here. My colleague here, archaeologist Ryszard Barkowiak, is a small person, and that makes the trees look bigger than they actually are. Okay, next slide, please. Here we are building a bit of a Roman ship for a display, and we were trying out what we'd been learning about early Roman woodwork in practice to learn more about it. So one of the key features I've briefly mentioned about the Roman woodworking revolution in Britain, based on the archaeological evidence, is that they used a lot of square timber. And here you can see in a slightly washed out slide, Richard again preparing a square bulk of timber. Very often these were prepared to standardized dimensions of a pes monetalis, or just under a modern British foot, 292 millimeters or thereabout square, or actually in this case, no, it's a bigger one than that. It's nearer the cubit size. So their standardized dimensions is what they're aiming for. 1 foot or a cubit, which is, some of you can see the screen, slightly smaller than my cubit, because the average Roman Londoner was a bit smaller than me. That's 440 millimeters approximately. This is also a dimension that Diocletian mentions in the edict as being a typical size for oak timber. Cubit square girth by 21 pes monetalis long. And we find quite a lot of planks, particularly in the earlier Roman structures, which are of that size, and also of oak, i.e. one of our 2 native species of oak. Next slide, please. Here you can see at the top a reconstruction drawing I did of one of these bulks being sawn into planks based on drain planking and sometimes building floor planking that we find. Often we don't get complete lengths, but occasionally we do. And where we have had that, we're looking at planks just over 6.1 something meters long, which fits quite well with the standardized oak dimension of 21 pes monetalis square. So again, square timber, standard dimensions, and very importantly, the introduction of the saw for cutting along the grain to make planks and small beams occasionally, but mainly planks. This is a totally new tool that doesn't exist in the Iron Age, what we call the pre-Roman Iron Age, where people are relying on using round timber or splitting it into sections and so on. And there's a Roman image below. This is from Meg's book on trees and timber in the classical Mediterranean, 1982. Next slide, please. Oh, the bottom images, rather. The other kind of saw they introduced is for cross-cutting. So this would probably be called a serrata or something like that. Here I'm trying to make writing tablets in a way we discovered was being done in central London. That's not what the talk's about, so I won't go on about it, but you can see a Roman-style crosscut saw. Again, this is the sort of tool that wasn't there before the Romans arrived. So there was a revolution in technology and in tools, which we'll hear more about in a minute. Next slide, please. This, I can't quite see all the slide, but I expect you can. This is the floor frame of a sunken floored warehouse building found in Southwark. Oh, I should backtrack and just say that all the woodwork that you'll be seeing, drawings or pictures of, original woodwork that is, of the early Roman period, is preserved by waterlogging along the Thames and the tributary, the Walbrook Valley, which is now infilled, a small tributary with absolutely full of wet deposits, which preserve timbers particularly well. Some of the other tributaries like the River Lee in East London, and also the suburb south of the City of London in Southwark. This building is from Southwark. It's the floor frame, and you can see it's a very regular modular system of building. The mortises, the square holes in the sill beams around the perimeter of the building are, except where there's a window, set 3 pes monetalis apart. You can also see the characteristic shape of the joists running across, which mirror the shape of coppice trees. For those of you who are familiar with that, they're as straight as they can reasonably make them from the coppice timber they're using. Next slide, please. So this isn't from wildwood timber. This is made from managed woodland timber, managed on a long, what we call a long rotation coppice system. So they're not making small sticks, they're making small logs for building with in that particular case. And here we're looking at a group of reused timbers from an excavation in 1989, which is where I first personally came across Roman timber frame construction. They're timbers from a building or buildings built in the same style that were reused as foundation piles for a slightly later Roman building. They date to the late 1st century. And you can see several examples in the picture. On the right of the slide is probably a wall plate timber from the top of a wall, which has the typical rather square Roman mortises we get, which you might call a stub mortise and tenon. There's a lap half dovetail running across the timber. Next to that is a sill beam from the bottom of the wall with a halving joint in the foreground, and these very square through mortises going through it. Each timber is made from a whole small oak log. To the left of that, roughly in the center, is a rebated corner post, a rather bigger timber. And the rebate or rabbet is there because the building was clad with thick sawn planks. You can just make out the nails that we use to hold the planking in place. And there are smaller stud and brace timbers to the left. Now, these timbers were preserved as a group and on display in the Museum of London Roman Gallery for some time, together with a replica section of Roman timber frame wall that we built. Next slide, please. Sorry if I'm speaking rather quickly, but I'm aware I don't have very long. So we could put the timbers together as a kind of wooden jigsaw, and we could follow the timber framing system they were using up to the level where the roof joined the walls. And since that period, i.e. the last 20 years, we have repeatedly found buildings preserved in situ as well as reused timbers, where the building is preserved up to about 1/2 meter high in position. Now, this is a system of building that's distinctively Roman. It's modular, it's framing, it's regular. The studs in this case, that's the wall uprights, are set 2 pesmo natalis apart. You can even see evidence for lighting towards the top left or top center of the slide. There's a lamp. We had burn marks where the lighting was fastened to the sides of the wall uprights as diagonal bracing, etc., etc. So this diagram is actually reconstructed from the group of timbers. I didn't mention the site. It's from the Cannon Street Station site. And fortunately, we've been able to find many examples of this sort of structure in situ, and you'll see 1 or 2 in a minute. Now, one other distinctive thing some of you may have seen is that the wattle work, the woven sticks that form the framework against which the daub is plastered, are woven vertically, which is a distinctive Roman thing. Next slide, please. Another bit of the carpentry revolution. Now, I'm afraid the publication for which these drawings are destined hasn't been finished yet, so you have to look at my working drawings. To the right is the formal Roman timber framing system with the vertically woven wattle work. With the studs, that's the wall upright set either a cubit apart or two pesmo natalis apart. These are typical sizes. Now, the local systems of building didn't disappear completely. In early Roman London, we do have some roundhouses. We even have one that was partially preserved by waterlogging, and unfortunately, I was on holiday when that was excavated. Just for a few days, and it was unfortunate I wasn't able to make more detailed records of some of what we found. However, we also see clear efforts where the local woodworkers are emulating Roman systems. They're making rectangular plan buildings, but they're using systems which are more familiar to them. So you see on the left here, rustic pole and stud wall, where the timbers are round or minimally dressed, minimally shaped, converted, and the wattle work is woven horizontally. In the bottom left, there's a picture showing the bigger round corner post, which is secured with a diagonal nail. One thing I should mention in the mortises that they use, they never peg them. Pegged mortises are found in joinery, in some forms of classical shipbuilding, which we'll be hearing a lot more about in the next seminar. And we have fragments of such vessels from London, and we have the County Hall ship, which is built in that style. And there are other systems of Roman ship construction too, where that isn't used. But this pegging of mortises and tenon joints is something which is not a feature of Roman constructional carpentry, at least in the northwest corner of the empire. Next slide, please. So just to take another look at this rustic, if you like, hybrid system where elements of pre-Roman technology are mixed together with the Roman introduction. And this is the Moorgate site, which I should be working on now rather than talking to you, but it's important to do both. We have buildings built of pisé laced with timber in this on this site. We have formal Roman timber frame building, and we have this rustic combined timber frame building. Now, just left of the center of the slide, there you can see some sill beams, or some people would call them base plates, from the base of a rustic Roman wall. Now we're going to look at the detail of a junction between a cross partition wall and the main wall now. Next slide, please. Here, it's a bit, the slide's been skewed, but what you can see here is round uprights in the wall, which is packed with a door made of the local brick earth, which is a clay silt mixture, which is ideal for making daub, mud bricks, rammed earth or Pisé construction, and so on, and modern bricks, fired bricks as well. Now you can see the round uprights. They're set in very shallow, crude mortises in the sill beams, some of which are reused. The reuse of Roman building timbers is quite common, as we heard in the Egyptian coffin construction and so on earlier, and in the Roman joinery. And you can see the wattle rods, the woven sticks are woven horizontally in this. So this is a kind of hybrid system, which isn't quite as precise or as regular as what I would call the formal, fully Romanized system that we see in some other buildings, including on this site. Next slide, please. We're nearly there. Okay, now this is slightly twisted to look at. Not one of the cleanest slides that my colleagues in Mola have ever produced. This is from the Bloomberg London site near where the Mithraeum temple was found. And what's interesting about this slide is that in the running from left to right in the middle of the screen is the lower part of a wall in situ. As I said, we find these things in situ up to about 0.6, 0.7 of a meter high above the contemporary Roman ground level, if we're very, very lucky, particularly in the Walbrook Valley, where the ground level was periodically raised about 0.7 of a meter. I'm pretty sure this is to do with controlling water supply for milling in that now almost completely infilled valley. And this means we get these kind of preservation bands about 0.7 of a meter high, preserving quite fragile wooden structures. Now, the significance of this slide is that on the right-hand side, the wall is made with round uprights and horizontally woven wattle. That's the original rustic Roman construction of the wall of this particular rectangular plan building. It's then been repaired in the formal Roman style, where you have vertically woven sticks, which you can see, I hope, on the left, and the studs, the squared studs, have been pulled out. So right near the left, there's an earth-filled void, and then about halfway along the slide, there's another one where the square, what we call studs, the minor posts of the wall, have been pulled out. There are also oak cross patterns in there around which the sticks are woven, but they're largely invisible. But this relates to the drawing I showed you earlier. Okay, we're nearly there. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, it's not true to say that the Romans completely abandoned earlier late prehistoric methods of woodworking, but even where they used it, so for example, splitting straight-grained oak timber to make things for buildings and other related structures like fencing, they tended to produce material that was much more standardized than the people before the Romans in this part of the world did. So even though the technology is quite similar, they applied it in a very, very regular, systematic way. So here we are splitting oak timbers on the edge of London in traditional woodland. And next slide, please. And this is a scene that Roman woodworkers would have been familiar with. Now, ignore the timbers on the left there. On the right, you can see what we call in English a pale fence made of radially split oak. Now, these pales are at least 1/64th divisions of the oak trees from which, or oak logs from which they were made. They may even be 1/28th splits. Basically, you split a log in half, then into quarters, into eighths, into 16ths, into 32nds, into 64ths, and into 128ths. Now, the Romans did this and produced rather standardized pale material. These things are wafer thin and standing in position as high as about 0.75 of a meter in situ. So this is a pale fence which has survived, in this case, from the about AD 70, just after AD 70. Now, so even though they're using an ancient technique which was there well before the Romans got here, they make these pales in a very standardized sort of way. They cut them to length of about 6 feet in modern English feet, so that's 1.84 meters or something like that. Where we find fallen over ones, we've got complete length examples. And they're only about 10 millimeters thick, 170 millimeters wide. So this is a very standardized product. And it's actually the same material that was used to cover the cabin of the Damian I Roman barge we were hearing about last week, which I've seen on a number of occasions. It's a material they use for all kinds of things, not just fencing. We have babies' coffins made of this material. It's sometimes used for cladding walls as well. So it's a standardized product, which they're using all over the place. Now, that's my last slide. I was going to say they also introduced some woodland tools, in this case, a special splitting tool we call a froe in English, or where I live, a dullax, which is a sort of meat cleaver type implement with a hole at one end through which you stick a lever. So in France, they're called fromage. In America, they're called things like shingle irons and so on. But it's a very clever tool used with a wooden holding device, which means you can split wood like oak or indeed silver fir and other species that are found further east in Europe into very fine divisions for making barrel staves, or in this case, fencing. Now, we haven't found one in London yet, but moving into the world of tools, you'll be hearing in the next slide what we have found. And there is apparently, Owen was saying, there's a possibility one may have turned up on a project that we both worked on, the A14 project in Eastern England, and further work will find out whether the tool is actually Roman or of medieval date. So it may be yet another tool alongside saws, planes, frequent use of iron nails, and many other intellectual tools, the concept of timber framing and measurement and so on, that the Romans introduced. It's fair enough, I think, to call it a revolution in building technology. There you go.
Excellent. Actually got a bit of an update since that blurb was written for the staff website. Research is now published, which is a very good thing for you sat there, because I listened in the first year of my PhD. I heard a presentation from someone who had just finished their PhD, and it was the most dejected and unenthusiastic presentation I've ever sat through. Now that it's all done and out the door and published, I don't have to care about it anymore. So that's great.
Well, we're looking forward to it.
How do I skip forward?
I just clicked.
Excellent.
And it goes,
yeah, that's great. Okay, so as I said, this is based on my PhD research rather than a modal project. This was a collaborative doctoral award set up by the Museum of London and the University of Reading, essentially to bring together a large corpus of objects from Roman London. London, of course, has fantastic preservation. You've already heard about the fantastic timber preservation. Metal objects also survive really well. And in the Walbrook Valley, in those dumps that are periodically deposited there that Damian talked about, they deposited large amounts of cultural material. This has been dug up sporadically over the past, say, 200 years by antiquarians and museums and archaeological units. But we haven't been as good at collecting all this data together and publishing it. So that's what this project was designed to do. It's designed to survey all of the museums in London, all of the archives, bring together all the material and analyse it. This includes tools from multiple industries. I mainly cover woodwork, agriculture, metalworking, and leatherworking, but there are a small number of tools from other industries as well. If you're interested in that sort of thing, you can pick up the book and you'll find a complete catalogue of these 837 objects and over 50 different typological and chronological schemes for analysing them. You'll, however, be very pleased to hear that I'm not talking about that today. This is the first detailed study of craft and industry in a Romano British city, and is available now in all good bookshops for a very reasonable $89.99, I believe. Okay, so that's great. Tools are very interesting. But London was, of course, a city full of people, and though that's what we're interested in talking about. So how can we talk about society using something as prosaic as iron tools? So I set out with two main aims, which was to examine the complexities of professional identity in the Roman period as a category of how people would have thought about themselves, and to see if there are ways in which everyday practice and these technologies could be seen as shaping people's identities and lived experiences. I'm not going to dwell on the theory too long, but this pulls together several different strains of theoretical thought. From the world of technology studies, you can look at the social construction of technology movement, which basically posits that rather than seeing technology as a linear progression of ideas, each one of which is better than the last one, you've got societies which can construct a way of living in which a particular technology functions. Similarly, the paradigm of technologies in use says that what's really important about technologies isn't who they're invented by or when they're introduced, but how they are used and who uses them. From the more typical Roman theoretical field of identity studies, we can look at themes like Romanization. Yes, we're all very sick of it, but it is relevant to this debate. And there are novel ways you can apply it, such as Cicerone's talking about an expanding toolkit being a facet of Romanization rather than just the adoption of new types of tools. Indeed, as Damian was just saying. And we're going to be talking about the concepts of professional identity and how that shapes your experience of life. And all of this can be wrapped up in a big bundle of practice theory that no one wants me to go into. Just to say that I don't find the modern ways of doing practice theory focusing on object agency to be particularly useful here, because it sort of sends you down a rabbit hole of technological determinism. So I think that's best avoided. Okay. Evidence of woodwork, as you all know, is comparatively rare from the ancient world. But in London, we have lots of resources, which mean that we're able to study it. So we've got about 220 iron tools, and that's of a total of, as you saw, just over 800. So that's about a quarter of the tools relate to woodwork. That's the largest category of any industry in London. We've got preserved wood, the sort of thing that Damian has been studying and publishing for many years now. And we've also got the whole plethora of classical sources, epigraphy and art, both from London locally and the whole Roman world. And what I attempted to do in this PhD was to bring this all together to come up with a specific interpretation focused on what life was like for the people using these tools in Roman London, rather than talking in a general way about the Roman Empire. What was it like for these people at this time in this place? Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about today. And I'm going to give you 3 areas in which I've attempted to do this. The first is looking at the concept of status and how that's expressed through tools. Next one is looking at specialization and people's lived experience of it. And the third is trying to identify social and cultural groups among London's woodworkers. So if we start with status, these are some holiday photos. This is the Estonian Open Air Museum. And if you go there, you will see lots of lovely displays of tools of people who were mainly farmers, but during the winter months when there wasn't much farming to be done, they practiced other trades and crafts. It was almost seen as a sort of a low status thing because it showed that you didn't own enough land to sustain yourself through the winter without having to do some sort of productive work. And then the very next day on the same holiday, I went to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, where you will also see a large display of woodworking tools. And that's because Peter the Great was a bit obsessed with woodwork, particularly shipbuilding. He went toured Europe trying to pick up these great Enlightenment ideas to improve Russian society, and spent a lot of time in shipbuilding yard. So for him, having these tools and knowing how to use them was an expression of his position as a great Enlightenment leader. So 2 groups of tools visited 2 days apart, but which mean completely different things for the status of the people using them. Can we see anything like this in the Roman period? Whilst we normally say that woodworking is a low status activity, there is reason to believe that it was undertaken by upper class people. This is particularly the case with Roman plains. You get things like Turner's Hall Farm, where you've got, I believe it's a 2nd century cremation burial of a woman who is richly furnished. It's got lots of nice vessels and jewelry. And it also has 2 woodworking plates, which may have been used to make arrows as sort of part of a kit for maintaining an elite lifestyle that included hunting, but with woodworking as a component of that. At Goodmanham, you have a plane made out of elephant ivory. And from Cologne, you have this really nicely decorated plane illustrated in a sketch down there. So we can see elements of woodworking appearing in a more elite context in the Roman world. Can we see this in Roman London? Well, no, but we can see other things that put woodworkers above the level of the lowest income groups that are demonstrated by, say, the Estonian example. So you get things like this, tools with makers' marks on them, which show that people are investing in tools that have a certain quality, that have almost a sort of brand recognition to them. Some of these might even have been imported from Europe. We also have things like this. This is a bradawl from Angel Court, and it's just really nicely made. The way in which it's mostly just square section all the way down, but shifting on its axis, and with a nice decoration around the blade, these little pointy extended langettes, which I don't even know how you achieve with a hammer, but It's very nice looking, and it's completely unnecessary for its function as a bradawl. A bradawl can just be a little stick of iron with a flattened end that you put in a wooden handle. This shows that we've got a level of investment in tools beyond the absolute basic required. We can also see involvement by the Roman citizen class in woodworking industries in London. So ignore the one on the left, that's a metalworking die, but this is a series of dies that have been found in London of the sort that would have been used by coopers to mark their product. And whether it doesn't necessarily mean that people of Roman citizen status were down by the dockyard stamping every timber of a barrel as they reassembled it, but it does show that these classes were involved in some way in managing the aspects of the woodworking industry in London. And I think these things also throw up an interesting relationship that people can have with tools, because in more modern contexts where these sorts of things have been used, the ownership of them and the use of them is very tightly controlled. So you can imagine there might be stratification within people who did have access to these official marks. So just on the subject of status, we can see even just from these bits of evidence that not all people who worked wood in London were low status woodworkers. Woodworking could be a hobby or sporting industry for the rich, although, as I say, no evidence of that specifically in London. And there's evidence for internal stratification among low status woodworkers through the investment in good tools, etc. And citizens were involved in these industries in some capacity. Now, moving on to specialization, I see that Roger Ulrich is in the audience. This is a table I've stolen from you. In Roman documents, texts preserved on monuments, what have you, Ulrich has identified lots of different types of specialization by which people identified themselves in the Roman world. And in the Roman period, we do see a proliferation of very specialized object types. So I wanted to think about how we can link specialized objects to specialization as a form of self-identification. And moreover, can we talk about how being a specialist in different types of materials would have affected your experience of being a woodworker? So, sticking with barrel making cooperage, we have Cooper's tools from London. We have the dies that I talked about before, and this odd saw-shaped thing on the left is a crow's. It's a tool for cutting the channel at the top and bottom of the barrel that the heads sit in. This is a find from the Bloomberg site, was published in the recent Writing Tablets volume, that is addressed to Ionia Cupario, which can be muted into English as Junius the Cooper. So we know that there are Cooper's tools in London, and there are people who are identifying themselves by the trade of cooperage. The trouble with that is that most of the barrels we find aren't made out of native British timbers. They're made out of alpine timbers, and it appears that these are arriving in London as part of its function as a trading centre. And so the profession of being a cooper isn't just this sort of idyllic master craftsman type lifestyle where you're taking raw materials and turning them into something. It's embedded in this wider network, and you're defining yourself by one small part of that, which is mostly going to be refurbishing barrels, although people were making Cooper products as well. I'm going to talk about planks now, which will again take us back to the things that Damian was talking about. So this is a warehouse building at Cooperage Brewery. I believe this is the same building that Damian was showing you the plan of the floor joists for. Yep, thumbs up, brilliant. So this is the plank floor that was sitting above it. And as Damian was saying, the Roman method of making planks was to square up timbers, and then you can take a ripsaw and peel off planks off the side of it, sort of like a Levallois prepared core type technology for wood. And we do, as Damian says, see the introduction of sorts of large two-man saws needed for this sort of work in the Roman period. There are also inscriptions talking about, not from London, but from continental Europe, talking about guilds of sawyers. But being a professional sawyer isn't the same as being, say, a professional cabinet maker. If you think about the way that this industry would have operated, it needs, by the nature of the technology, to involve multiple people in order to prop the timbers up and have two people to work this saw. Presumably, they don't own all of these tools cooperatively. So you've got some people who are owning the tools, some people who are just there as workers. And you're doing a sort of repetitive task which has a skill to it, but isn't the same as a sort of master crafts level profession, and isn't necessarily as transferable if you wanted to go independent. So again, it's an example of where you can be a specialist in something, but have a very different experience of that specialization to somebody who working, say, as a cooper or as a cabinet maker. So just to sum up my thoughts on the idea of specialization and lived experience, there's evidence from written sources for a high degree of specialization in the Roman period woodworking practice, with people making just a small number of objects with a very particular material type, or making composite objects from multiple materials. And this is supported archaeologically by the introduction of highly specialized tools. But the existence of specialization doesn't mean that everyone working wood in the Roman period is an autonomous master craftsman. They're embedded in this wider network of professionals. They will have had very different lived experiences because of the way that the technologies of their work operate. And I took out the final point, so I'm sort of left groping for the end of a sentence that isn't there. So finally, looking at social and cultural groups. Again, Damian has wonderfully introduced this topic for me. We see different forms of timber architecture in London, which indicate potentially that there are different, there are groups of woodworkers who are coming from a different cultural background. Can we see this reflected in any way in the tools? Well, we could look at the typology of objects and see where we have Iron Age type tools and where we have new Roman type tools. The problem with that, well, there's two problems with that. One of them is that there are very few Iron Age type tools in Roman London. There's also a problem with defining Iron Age tools in Britain, because there aren't that many late Iron Age tools for us to say definitively we know what tools looked like the year before the Romans arrived and the year after. But even taking that into account, the tools that you find in the Iron Age can be matched to equivalents that you find in the Roman period. If you need an adze and an axe and a chisel, you can find all of those things still in the Roman period. Their fundamental technology hasn't changed. What we do see that's different is, as I said before, this introduction of a wide range of new tool types. So things like the crows, which I mentioned, and this one below it is a moulding plane iron. So that's for making a decorative moulding, just a few swoops of the hand. And what a lot of these new introductions have in common, I think, is that they allow a degree of standardization of the products that you're making. Damian was talking about this in relation to timber buildings. If you're making wooden mouldings or decorative pieces of woodwork and you have a special plane to do it, you're going to get something that comes out the same every time, rather than handmade with slight differences. It also means that you have a very different relationship to being a professional woodworker, because we might think that in an Iron Age tradition where you have fewer tools, you've got a small number of tools that you have to use in a diverse way, and that's what makes you an expert in something. Whereas in the Roman period, it would rely more on you being able to have the resources to own a large number of very specialized tools. So we have this evidence for a quite abrupt change in tool types at the start of Roman period. As I said, London, you more or less only find the Roman types of tools, although we know that there are different traditions working there. We also see evidence that this exchange of people and tool types continues throughout the Roman period and into the post-Roman period. So this is a collection of axes, most of them unstratified, which sort of sit in the late Roman to early medieval typological spectrum. This one on the top left, the very rusty one, is one of the ones that is nicely stratified in the late Roman context. And it's got this widened pole, which is characteristic of a lot of axes that have been found in Pannonia. And these provide evidence that rather than there being an Iron Age cultural tradition was replaced by a Roman tradition, when London is incorporated into the Roman Empire, there is a continuing movement of people and continuing refreshment of new woodworking traditions as time goes on. And the other main cultural group that gets talked about a lot in the Roman period is, of course, the Roman army. We can see military architecture in London with buildings like the Timber Guildhall, which has parallels on the continent. There are some stamps on timber which indicate that they were harvested and controlled by Roman military units. Identifying a military style of tool is tricky. So these tools, an axe and a mattock, both have these little projecting lugs on either side of the shaft hole. And these are something that first appears in Roman military contexts. But I don't know that in London it would indicate that these tools are evidence of military woodworkers, because we see in so many aspects of provincial material culture, the army is the agent for introducing new types of material into a province. And therefore, the army style of material culture becomes dominant. It's why, say, hobnailed shoes are so common in the northwestern provinces, because that was a military style of construction that then moved into being in the civilian sphere. That appears to be the same thing with these lugged objects. However, the one on the left, the mattock, is interesting, because Damian has identified tool marks at, I believe, the Guildhall Amphitheatre, which were made by an axe-like object that had a broad but very thin blade. Almost all Roman axes that we find have this very pronounced wedge shape, as you can see on the axe on the right there. But these mattock-type implements have that very thin blade. They are something that was probably part of standard military equipment, and that could indicate military units being directly involved in woodworking in London. So to conclude on the social and cultural groups, London was a diverse city, and that diversity extended into the group of craft workers we see. We've got evidence of cultural contact that is much more complicated than just replacement of a native culture by a Roman culture. And we see that incorporation into the empire didn't necessarily mean the replacement of all carpentry traditions, but did change the ways in which craft skill could be expressed. And that continued to change throughout the Roman period. And we can also see social and cultural groups beyond those linked to culture and ethnicity, mostly the Roman army, but also in the professional specialization that we discussed before. So I realised I was talking quite fast there. How long did I take? Oh, it's fine. I filled up the time. So to conclude about woodworkers in Roman London, I hope this study of tools and related objects has shown that woodworkers was a very diverse group of people, different statuses, specializations, and social and cultural backgrounds. And there was no one experience of being a woodworker, even in just Roman London. And if we reflect back on our original aims, I hope this has shown that professional identity is very complex, and that prosaic, iron, unattractive objects that have been sat around for 200 years can still tell us something new about lived experience and identity in this setting. This project was funded by the AHRC through the University of Reading and the Museum of London. Although MOLA weren't officially involved, they gave me fantastic access to all their objects and really helped a lot with getting this publication out there, as did all the other museums I visited to let me look at their stuff. So thanks to them, and thank you for listening.